Adventures in the Number Trade. How public opinion polls decimate the truth. Polls are something I know a bit about because I am, if you will excuse the pun, low pollster on the totem pole. I work in what's euphemistically called fielding. That is, I conduct interviews over the telephone. I'm one of the people who call you up in the evening just as you're about to sit down to supper and badger you for, quote, a few minutes of your time, end quote. The company I work for is one of the largest in Canada. Because I was sworn to secrecy when I was hired, I can't tell you which one. Or rather, I'd feel safer dropping coy hints about its identity while scrupulously guarding my own. The company I'll refer to as Infodex. My own name, well, let's just say I'm known as Pete. By using a nom de téléphone, I can at least distance myself from one of the major stresses of my job, which is, after all, attempting to monopolize other people's free time. I ask them in tones both neutral enough to suggest the disinterest of a non-salesman and friendly enough to suggest the encouragement of a good-natured college kid, questions designed to further causes not necessarily in their own interest. While the company I'm working for was referred to above as Infodex, usually I call it Eastbourne Research Center when launching into my survey. This is a sub-pseudonym. Infodex generally prefers to hide its identity, out of the understandable fear that its name is too highly associated with the present government to be considered unbiased. Like a minimum wage Nostradamus, I look into the future, but not too far. As befits my low earnings, $7.25 an hour, I can see only 2 or 3 weeks in advance. Infodex is the company that did pre-referendum polling, as well as public opinion tracking for the federal government during the heat of the campaign for the Charlottetown Accord. It's in this way I witnessed firsthand how the truth is both expressed verbally and compressed numerically. I saw, too, how something was lost in the process, and this something was also the truth. Most interviewers working for polling companies are people in their late teens or early 20s. Blithely disinterested in politics, they're trained to read the questions off their computer screens verbatim like machines. When an interviewee asks a question like, "What do you mean by status, privilege or standing?" the interviewer is technically not supposed to answer. Not because of lack of knowledge, but because the senior supervisors don't trust these kids to give their own explanations without botching it. The survey itself is treated as holy text, not to be veered from its scientificness, never to be questioned. This sometimes makes the supervisors seem insanely literal-minded, as they hector interviewers to pronounce every single word. Coached in this way, interviewers, like congenitally dim bureaucrats in a Monty Python sketch, sometimes seem to hear nothing but the following magic words: strongly agree, somewhat agree, neither agree nor disagree, somewhat disagree, strongly disagree. Either that or a number on a scale. The cajoling of a respondent I mentioned above is known within the nomenclature of polling as probing, and is considered good methodology. By keeping don't knows to a minimum, survey results appear to be more crisply defined than they are. These subtle inaccuracies in survey responses are multiplied by the hundreds. The resulting half-truths do not seem to the analysts, the mid-level professionals who interpret the surveys, to exist. An experiment is only scientific if all the variables can be measured. Social science is notoriously difficult to practice well because of one of the variables, people, is so complex. A respondent population's comprehension of a series of questions may be false. Unless this too is measured, the results are semi-science, science with a question mark. Much has been written about the negative influence polls might have had during election campaigns, but little is known about the, quote, street reality, end quote, of polling. Pollsters point out with pride at their ability to predict elections, and the results are fairly accurate. but sometimes they screw up terribly. The recent referendum campaign serves as a classic example of how street reality differs from its statistical cousin. In mid August of 1992, when the federal government had reached the Charlottetown Accord and was considering calling a national referendum, it was already under intense pressure from two fronts. The first was the impending referendum on October 26th in Quebec, and the other was constitutional burnout among politicians, their aides, and the country at large. The feds knew that in order to sell the deal to Quebec, they needed all the leverage they could get. A national referendum seemed like just the tool. It would pressure the no side in Quebec while providing a focal point for patriotism in the rest of the country. This was a reasonable assumption. Theoretically, at least, this deal made up for all the shortcomings of Meech Lake. Don Getty in the West had been placated with a Triple E Senate. Clyde Wells and Ovid Mercredi were on side, and before that, Keith Spicer had traveled around the country with millions of dollars in video equipment to quote-unquote interface, Moses Neimer-like, with the people. Before the referendum was even announced, pollsters were already feeling the territory, attempting to calculate what margins of support existed for the accord. The federal government probably had no illusions about the nature of discontent that existed in English Canada, bitterness toward Quebec, bitterness towards Mulroney, and bitterness about the economy. But its strategists didn't seem too alarmed at public anger as long as it appeared unfocused. In mid-August, people were responding to the questions in our surveys with a degree of equanimity, though they were angry about the Meech Lake-like parts of the deal. The vast majority of them came across as being undecided, because the survey at this point could not mention a vote. Misled subtly into thinking their responses were just grist for the curiosity of the polling mill, people did not speak with determination. They would say suspiciously, "Who's this survey for?" And we'd respond disingenuously, "Our supervisors never tell us who the client is. This is just a survey like the kind you read about in the paper." Furthermore, many respondents were simply ignorant of the deal's contents. Time after time, people would say, their voices almost wailing, "I don't know anything about it." Our soothing response was, "That's okay. This is just an opinion survey. You don't really have to know a lot about it. We're just trying to get people's reactions at this time." Engaged in deep-fried questioning, we transformed doubt into little nuggets of certainty. These fast food answers were in turn gobbled down the statistical gullet in order to satiate the hunger of the yes side. But the pollsters, asking the wrong questions, misread ignorance as apathy and disagreement as mild disgruntlement. The result for the federal government was a national heart attack. The no side had considerably more support in English Canada than the yes side realized, and all that support was waiting for was somebody to come along and galvanize it. Predictably, Preston Manning did, and then Judy Rebick, and then, most controversially, Pierre Trudeau. At the end of a cool summer, support for the no side started snowballing. Pollsters, like seducers, subconsciously count on a certain degree of ignorance and naive goodwill on the part of those they wish to influence. But like seducers, they also have to be sensitive to the various nuances of gesture and tone of voice that signal repulsion and attraction. It might surprise many in the general public to find that the analysts who design, interpret, and defend these polls go nowhere near the phone to conduct interviews. Similarly, analysts might be startled to discover people think they should have closer contact with the people whose opinions they claim to understand. Choices such as no opinion or don't know are rarely voiced by interviewers when questions are being read during a survey, and it doesn't take much acquaintance with the polling industry to figure out why this should be so. These are not responses the pollster wants to hear. The exaggeration of certainty creates an ambience of knowledge. Mediocrity is best concealed by not grappling with the amorphousness of society. But because the pressures are enormous, short timelines, massive numbers of completes to be finished, and a grouchy population, a maybe is as good as a yes or no in the world of polling. And the pressures are increasing. The company I work for is starting to demand higher levels of productivity from its interviewers, and this means, all things being equal, the Canadian population not getting any more enamored with being quizzed exhaustively, that more corners will have to be cut, more people bullied into finishing, quote, just the last page, end quote. To paraphrase Nietzsche, how can so much air lead to truth? The answer is in yesterday's paper.